The assassination itself, where were you and what were you doing? Your reaction to it? What you did after you heard the news? What do you remember about that day? The Warren Commission, the controversy that surrounded that. We can also go back beyond that and spend some time talking about the Kennedy years, the years 1961 through 63. What do you remember? And the years 63 through 67 that might have also been the Kennedy years had it not been for the shooting in Dallas. And we do that by telephone, and you're invited to call. We have one line open at this minute in the North Bay, 453-6523. And we'll take some more calls on John Kennedy Remembered in just a minute. Hello, this is Jimmy.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
That's a pretty hard act to follow.
Yeah, it is.
It is indeed. But anyway, I want to discuss my recollections of him. Fortunately, I got a little closer to him than you did. In 1956, he appeared in El Paso with Lyndon Johnson to supposedly stump for Stevenson. And unfortunately, I think Johnson didn't mention Stevenson one time, and Kennedy mentioned him only once. So I had the feeling then that they were both running for that office at that time, and as it turned out 4 years later, they were the ticket. But I was impressed with him, but I supported Stevenson up until Kennedy was nominated. And then, of course, because of the man he was running against, I had no trouble at all supporting Kennedy.
You remember in 1956, he tried to get nominated vice president at the convention.
No, he didn't really want that.
He didn't?
You remember Kefauver was the one who hoped to get the nomination, and the South was so mad at him that they decided that they would throw their support to Kennedy to show Kefauver what they thought of him.
Well, at the Chicago convention that year, Kennedy got quite a few votes for a guy who didn't want him.
And that's the reason that he did. And when they saw, first of all, they thought, well, this is good publicity. And then they thought, well, look out. If you get this nomination, this vice presidential nomination, they didn't feel Stevenson was going to win.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't feel this would be good for him. And so I think they did what they could to try to stall it off at that point. They wanted to make a good showing, but they surely didn't want it. That was my understanding.
I see.
And to say that most of his votes, strangely enough, came from the South because of their antipathy toward Kefauver at the time, if you'll remember that. And that was the reason for that. Kefauver got it, if you'll remember.
Yep.
He had really worked hard for that. But anyway, and after, in 60, of course, then I supported him. And then going on down the line, yes, I voted for him. I'm very happy to say one thing I've never done is voted for Mr. Nixon. But I was at work the day that happened, and I was working for Internal Revenue at the time, and it just happened at lunchtime, if you'll remember. I don't know where you were, but it was lunchtime out here.
Yeah.
And, I went outside and didn't feel like eating anyway. And finally I decided, I can't possibly go back to work. But I went back to tell them I was going to take the rest of the day off. By that time, they come to the conclusion that nobody would have his mind on his work. So they just let him go home.
Mm-hmm.
And this other fellow that I was working with, we went up to his place and turned on the radio, and we were positive that some right-wing nut in Texas had done this. And then when we found out it was supposed to be Oswald, it was a rather shock to us because we above all, we just didn't feel that, nobody left-wing would have wanted to kill the man because everybody was claiming he was a friend of theirs, And so we just couldn't believe that Oswald, did it or somebody like that, although it appeared that was so. And what I want to say that I'm sure a lot of people felt, and I did too, and it's especially, if you'll notice, if you follow this right along, it isn't just a matter that it's 10 years since. The conditions of this country in the last year have caused us to focus more on Kennedy than we might have otherwise done in spite of the passage of time and the 10th year.
Why do you suppose?
I think we're disillusioned. We're terribly disillusioned, and Kennedy didn't inspire that. He inspired idealism. He inspired hope. He inspired trust, and yes, he inspired love, which is something unfortunately, that Nixon has never done to the bulk of the American people. They voted for him more out of fear and more out of uncertainty about the one who was running against him. I'm talking about this last election. And I think, this is one observation I'm going to throw into it, I think that the people that voted for Nixon, and maybe even Nixon himself, can never forgive Kennedy for the fact that the people did have a genuine feeling for him and did feel that he was a positive force in American life, and Nixon is the exact opposite. And
Okay.
that's why you'll find an outpouring now that perhaps wouldn't have been here had Nixon been less the kind of man and candidate and president that he's been.
I've got to move along, but let me ask you one more question. Do you think anything would have been different in the years 63 through 67 if he had not been killed?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind about that. It's difficult to put your finger on it, but you'll remember this, since you brought it up. They'll say he didn't do anything. Well, you must remember he was elected by a very narrow margin. And I don't have any doubt that had he run in 64, he would have been elected by perhaps the same margin or maybe even greater than Johnson was in 64.
Mm-hmm.
And that had he received, a reasonable working vote, that the program that went into effect under Johnson would have gone into effect under Kennedy as well.
Okay, got to go, but I appreciate your call. John F. Kennedy, the man, the president, the father, the husband, the fallen president. We're talking about the Kennedy years then and what has resulted since then.
Jim, this is Lori.
Hi.
And I like this last name that called, has called in other times, and I think he's an extremely intelligent individual. But he's so right in saying that everybody now can't help but compare Kennedy and Nixon Monday morning quarterbacking. And I think it's been good for the public. As you mentioned before, Kennedy, I think, was more interested in negotiation, and Nixon's been nothing but confrontation. I think that Nixon's a 19th century man trying to hang on to it. And I think Kennedy was a 20th century man. Now, I don't put anybody on a pedestal, and I voted for Nixon in 60, more out of lack of knowledge. But I think, too, as this last man mentioned, that people have had to vote reluctantly out of bad choices that we have been very carefully steered towards, rather than having good choices that will nurture our country. And I think that this can do nothing but destroy the United States. Yesterday's paper had an article, I think it was the Chronicle, I read both the Examiner, but how Nixon handled the Middle East alert, and I would like to know, maybe you can find out some other day, whether Kennedy, I don't think with his personality he did, I think he liked people, because in the Cuban alert, I have a hunch he didn't stay in his apartment and handle the National Security Council meeting without even going, as Nixon did, and there were only 4 of them there because Agnew's gone, Kissinger has 2 titles, Lincoln, the emergency preparedness, had left about a year and a half ago. So it's appalling, and if you'll read that article tomorrow, maybe get a comparison sometime in the future, I think it'd be very interesting.
Okay, let me ask you a question now. You made a statement that went by a little faster, and I think we ought to examine it. You said something about negotiation versus confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little revealing to go back and look at the Kennedy years and look at the Kennedy statements on the subjects of Russia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
And we almost went to war with Russia over Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard Nixon's over there drinking vodka with him. And John Kennedy said repeatedly that he didn't want Red China in the United Nations, and he was ready to go to war almost to defend Quemoy and Matsu and the offshore islands, and now here Richard Nixon's over there drinking tea with him.
Mm-hmm, but
John Kennedy heated up the war in Vietnam, and Nixon got us out of it.
Well, but don't forget that people who are ultra-right-wing can do things that are ultra-radical, and the people will trust them. Whereas if someone openly proclaims themselves more liberal, they can't do a darn thing on a liberal program. And unfortunately, I wish people would look a little more back of it. But I don't think Kennedy would have stopped the sergeant and then have his, in Orlando, and then have his lieutenant colonel give him a call so he'd be sure and say the right thing. I don't think he would have shoved a Ziegler. I think Kennedy liked himself, and because he grew up with there were 9 children and a retarded sister, I think he liked human beings. And I think Nixon neither understands people nor does he like himself or people. And with 210 million of us, I think that being gregarious, but reading as Kennedy did, is a much wiser choice of a person. I also think if he had gotten bogged down in Vietnam, he would have withdrawn sooner and listened to public opinion more, because the Congress certainly didn't. Whereas Nixon, I think his ego is so tremendous that he insists on being stubborn, even if stubbornness means destruction. And you can't be that way in your personal life. There are times when you've got to lose to win later. It's like a bridge game.
Okay, and I got to lose right now to win later, or I'll be out of work here. I appreciate your call, and I thank you for your sentiments. What did John Kennedy accomplish in his short term in office? Did he do anything? One of the statements that has been repeatedly said about John Kennedy's term in office is that he talked about and started the ball rolling for a lot of things that he probably could not have gotten finished, but that in the year following his death, Lyndon Johnson did. That Johnson picked up the ball and scored the touchdown, so to speak, whereas Kennedy might have gotten in trouble trying to get them passed. Theodore White, author of the many bestsellers, Making of the Presidents of Whatever Years, covers that subject, I think, at least in a paragraph that'll make you think a little bit. In the hardback edition of his Making of the President, 1964, on page 25, Theodore White says, "It is customary now to refer to the moment of his death as the moment of his great deadlock with Congress." And indeed it was, for as he went on and grew more sure of himself, his pace and his appetite for change quickened with every month, until finally Congress, digging in its heels, balked at the 2 greatest of his domestic measures. Yet one must note, beyond the defeats and reversals he suffered in Congress, how much new legislation was actually approved and passed into law, more than at any other time since the 1930s. Of 53 major proposals brought to the first session of the 87th Congress, Kennedy won enactment of 33. Of 54 brought before the second session, Kennedy won enactment of 40. Of 58 before the first session of the 88th, Kennedy won 35. This legislation slowly changed not so much the shape and structure of the country as the country's way of looking at itself. These, to be sure, were major domestic achievements, but the 2 greatest domestic legacies were those most dramatically deadlocked at the moment of his death. Those, however, were the ones that most directly influenced the election of 1964. Then he talks about the economy of the country and the Civil Rights Act. At the bottom of that page, in a footnote, Teddy White says, "Space prohibits anything more than the most fragmentary list of legislative enactment, but even the most partial list gives something of the flavor of his governing style. In 1961, establishment of the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, the Area Redevelopment Act, Community Health Facilities, Juvenile Delinquency Study Appropriation, Minimum Wage Increase, Water Pollution Act. In 1962, Reciprocal Trade Act, Communications Satellite Act, Manpower Development and Training Act, Educational TV, Drug Labeling Act, Poll Tax Amendment, National Institute for Child Health. In 1963, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, Mental Health Act, Maternal and Child Health Act, Higher Education Act, the National Cultural Center in Washington, Aid to Medical Education, Air Pollution. And this is only the minimal listing of the most vigorous 3 years of legislation since the first term of Roosevelt." That's from Theodore Roosevelt's Making of the President, 1964, as he summarized the Kennedy years on page 25. So there was something done. A lot of folks say it wasn't so much the substance as it was the style. He got us thinking in a different way and looking at each other in a different way. Perhaps.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Patty, and I'm 28, and I can vividly remember when the president was shot. I was a senior in high school in the Midwest in a little town in Ohio called Kent, which is, since achieved great notoriety. But I remember I was sitting in home economics class, and one of the girls was going to the office to ask for permission to be absent from school the following Monday. She had a doctor's appointment. She was gone for quite some time. And she came back, and she was crying, and she sat down next to me, and I said, "Well, Donna, what's the matter?" And she said, "You're not going to believe this, but when I was in the office, I heard that President Kennedy had been shot. And I looked at her and I said, Donna, that's really incredible. I can't believe that. Well, about a minute later, the principal of our school came over the intercom system and he said the president had been shot. Well, I have never in my life felt so sick, so disappointed, so disillusioned by anything as I did at that time. The class just erupted into a mass of sobs and tears, and the teacher had no control over any of us. We all just kind of meandered out into the hall, and we were running to our best friends and trying to console each other. And a group of my friends and I, who were Catholic, decided to go up to our Catholic church and pray for the president, not knowing that he was dead at the time. And ironically enough, we went up to the church, and the priest that delivered the news that President Kennedy was shot was named Father Kennedy. And when he came out to deliver the news, we all kind of looked up rather apprehensively, hoping that maybe the worst, wasn't going to be the death. But it did come. And I think I must have wandered around on my way home for at least 2 hours, not knowing exactly where I was going. I knew I wanted to go home to watch television to find out what was happening and what the other reactions were. Everything was just like in total chaos. There was no noise, though. People were just kind of walking by with, teared eyes and kind of misguided.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first time I'd ever seen any reaction from anybody in my family. I got in the door, and my mother had come home from work, and she was sitting there just absolutely sobbing. And I don't know, it was a very heartbreaking time.
I had the feeling that from the minute we first got the word, which out here was about 10:30 in the morning, our time,
yes.
From the minute we first got the word until it finally settled in on us that he was actually gone, there were two things that I can remember, two distinct feelings. There was a lot of grief, a lot of crying, a lot of sadness. There's also a feeling of, I don't believe it. I simply don't believe it.
That was my reaction. I thought, no, this can't be. This is America. Assassinations are past history.
Mm-hmm.
It'll never happen again. But unfortunately, we found out that America is not as safeguarded as we thought it was, and we cannot protect our political figures as well as we had hoped.
Now, let me ask you something else. Since that time and the subsequent assassinations that have taken place,
yes.
Have you had that same feeling again?
That the country is secure?
No, the same feeling of grief and disbelief.
Yes, but I've become numb in my feelings about
Right.
it.
That's the part that kind of disturbs me, is the fact that I can remember how I felt when it first happened. I can remember looking through my own tears at everybody else's and still being shocked and not believing it and just being stunned by it all. And since that time, there's another feeling that enters into it, and that is, here we go again.
Exactly.
And you sit back waiting by your radio to see who's going to get hit next.
Really, and it's tragic that we do look at it from that point of view, that we are just sitting back and waiting, and we're not taking any protective measures.
Yeah.
For our leaders. I think the loss of Kennedy was probably one of the greatest losses this country has had in a long time. And I remember one thing very clearly when I did find out that he was dead. It wasn't as though the president of my country had been shot. It was like my brother had been shot, and I come from a family of all girls, and it just was, I took it so personally. And
Okay.
it took a very long time for me to recover from that feeling.
I'm going to have to talk to some more people now, but I'm certainly glad you called. I appreciate it. Call again. We'll continue on the telephone here in just a minute. Hello, this is Jim Eason.
Hi.
Hi.
The day that Kennedy was assassinated, we were having a Chinese dinner in a Cantonese restaurant in Madrid, Spain.
Wow.
My husband had complained that the dishes were cold, and suddenly there was a lot of commotion in the restaurant, and we thought, that's funny, just because Americans complain. Then we returned to our hotel at midnight. The elevator boy spoke in English and Spanish. I could understand Spanish. He said, "Su presidente es muerta. Johnson, too, boom, boom," and he pointed to his head and shot, and we were just aghast, thinking maybe Johnson had shot him and then committed suicide. The next morning, we woke up, and you could not buy a newspaper in that town. The people were absolutely openly grieving and weeping and conjecturing, and my own reaction immediately was, my God, it's a plot because of that Bay of Pigs thing, you know, in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
The reason we liked Kennedy was because we're also Irish Catholic, and many of the members of our family resembled them, and I think it was his boyish good looks and charm, really, that had the greatest effect. But then the sequel to this story, the next morning we went to breakfast, and the other couple at our table was a very well-to-do man from Dallas, Texas, and his wife. And when we discussed it, he said, "Tell Bells, why did it have to happen in Dallas? They'll think that Johnson had something to do with it, and no one in Dallas wanted Lyndon in the White House." Well, that sort of stunned us, and the coverage was wonderful. As my husband wrote, midnight returned from dinner to learn that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The elevator boy in sketchy English told us. The Madrid papers are full of all details about President Kennedy's assassination. Very fast, very good coverage. 2 hours after it happened in Dallas, we knew about it in Madrid. Time passed 3 or 4 days. We flew home to be here for Thanksgiving. At that time, my son was 20 in college. My 2 daughters were 17 and 15. Their aunt was babysitting them. They came to meet us at the airport, and instead of the usual hugs and kisses and greetings, they were all just crying profusely, and all they could talk about was the assassination. When we got home, we have a darling little maple rocking chair in our dining room, and my little boy had put one of those photo lamps that you use for indoor photography. He had clamped that onto the rocking chair. He had focused the beam on the flag outside our windows at half-mast staff, and he left it there for the entire period of mourning. We missed all of that horrible stuff that happened immediately after the assassination. Thank goodness for it, because I don't think we could have stood it. We were so grief-stricken. Well, time passed, and we have often wondered whether he would have continued to exercise the same influence. I really think that his personal looks and personality had a lot. You know, they obscured other things that might not have been there, but which he created the illusion of being better than he was, but we still liked him. Well, we went to Ireland in 1965, and we happened to go to Galway, Ireland, the place where he had been visiting and given the speech. Outside of our hotel was the public square where Kennedy had appeared in person, and they were dedicating that square. They were making it into a park in memory of Kennedy. We went the length and breadth of Ireland, and every public place we went, there were photographs of the Kennedys. They had actually elevated the man to sainthood. I guess he was the most wonderful person who ever was Irish, you know, became famous and was Irish. But I wrote this experience about being in Spain to Mrs. Kennedy right after the funeral and all, and I got a charming letter from her thanking me for letting her in on reactions that occurred, you know.
Let me thank you for your call now, because I've got to move along, but I appreciate that. That's the kind of thing we want to hear. We'll be back in just a minute.
I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I called on architects and contractors. It was just before Kennedy was elected, and I finished my job at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. My next one was in Albuquerque. We started to drive to Albuquerque. It had been in the paper that Kennedy was going to make a speech at the La Fonda Hotel that night, and as we were driving towards Albuquerque, a plane went right over our car. And I said, you know, I bet that's that fellow Kennedy's plane. And so we drove over to the airport just out of curiosity, and sure enough, it was. Well, they were having Frontier Days in Santa Fe at that time, and, you know, the men were running around with beards and hats.
Yeah.
And they had set up a mock jail alongside the airport. Well, Ted Kennedy was with him, and they put a top hat on Ted Kennedy and put him in this mock jail. They took television pictures, and that night it looked as though he and I were in there together. And he was obviously early for the dinner, so people were standing around, and we did too. My wife was standing alongside of me. She looked to her left, and there was Jack Kennedy, and he stuck out his hand. He said, "So glad you could come." Well, my wife was a little cute anyway. She said, "Oh, we just happened to be going by, and we thought it might be you." And we shook hands, and he talked for about 5 minutes. about 4 weeks later, we were in Denver, at the Denver airport, Stapleton Field. At that time, they had some of the best strawberry pie we've ever tasted. We went out one evening and decided to, about 11 o'clock at night, to stop at the airport and have some of this pie. Well, the coffee shop in the airport has one door to the lobby, another door to the off-ramp where people come off planes. We had the pie. We went out the door onto the off-ramp, and just as we opened the door, somebody came right in front of me, and it was Bobby Kennedy. Well, at that time, they weren't as well known as they are now, and I mistook him for Ted Kennedy. So I slapped my hand on his shoulder, and I said, by the way, the last time I saw you, you were in jail. And he said, you got to give him credit for fast thinking. He stuck out his hand. He said, how did that celebration come out anyway? And then he went on up the ramp all by himself, carrying his own suitcase, and there was a woman standing at the head of the ramp waiting for him. That's all there was to that incident.
I'll be darned.
The second incident, we were in Dallas. My wife rode around with me while I called on some contractors. I came out of a contractor's office. She had been listening to the car radio, and she said, Kennedy's plane has just touched down at Love Field. We were only about 10 blocks from Love Field, so I said, fine, let's go over and see the parade start. So we drove over, and for those of you who know Dallas, there's a double drive down to Morningside Drive, and then we were going to make a loop through town. And we saw the parade start, and we weren't 10 feet from the car when he went by. Well, my wife said that she wanted to go back to the motel for the afternoon because she wanted to do something. So I said, fine, we'll take the shortcut. And we took the shortcut that took us past the Trade Mart where he was going to speak. He was going to make the loop through town. So Edith said, you know, I didn't get a good enough look at Jackie Kennedy's dress. I've got to see that again. So she made me park. And we went on to the off-ramp that turns onto, you to make a right turn onto Industrial Boulevard. We stood there about 45 minutes, and all of a sudden, here comes complete confusion. The car makes a right turn on two wheels. Kennedy's feet were about not more than 10 or 12 feet from us, and then the car went right on up the hill to the Parkland Hospital, and the funny part of it was a lot of people had transistors, but nothing came on anybody's radio for about 5 minutes. Well, then here came 3 or 4 buses loaded with newsmen. They all came down. They made a right turn onto Industrial Boulevard. They made a right turn into the Trade Mart, and they all solemnly filed out to hear Kennedy's speech. And here he was already dead up in the hospital at the top of the hill. And it's something that you won't forget. I realize there's nothing profound about it, but it's just an incident that you don't forget in a hurry.
Well, it doesn't have to be profound. We're just chatting here today, and I'm glad you called.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. The fellow was right there. Right there, pretty close. In just a minute, you'll hear the recorded voice of John Kennedy at some press conferences. These are excerpts. You won't hear one whole press conference. Highlights. Most of them are slightly amusing or very funny, and I think you'll enjoy that in just a minute. In the presidential campaign of 1960, I leaned a little bit toward Richard Nixon. I thought he was probably the more qualified man to be president. After all, I didn't know who this upstart Kennedy was. He was too young for the office. He was too inexperienced. Mr. Nixon had been vice president under Eisenhower, the great general. And so I leaned more toward Nixon. Then, as the results came in on election night, I started to prepare for the results. I was working with Armed Forces Radio, and to prepare for election night coverage, I had to research the two men, their backgrounds, their campaign, their people around them, and so forth. Listen to the television debates. Didn't have TV debates at the time. We had radio debates where I was. But I got more interested in John Kennedy, personally in John Kennedy, not so much his politics or his voting record or anything, but I found him to be a fascinating man. As the years went on, I'm telling you now where my prejudices and biases lie. As the years went on, I didn't vote in the 1960 election. And, of course, he wasn't around for 64, so I don't know whether I would have voted for him or not. But I liked his style, and I liked the man. I especially liked his performance under fire. For example, at the press conferences. That's something we're missing now and have been missing since 1963. Lyndon Johnson was not a bowl of laughs at his press conferences. Neither is our current president. But back in those days, press conferences were more than just facts and questions and opinions and backbiting and replies and so forth. Once in a while, there was something funny about them. And here are a couple of examples.
No political question, sir. The Republicans are holding leadership conferences around the country, including here in Washington today, with the purpose of upsetting the democratic balance of power in the congressional elections that are coming up. Would you care to comment on the task these Republican teachers have, and with what hope they might look towards success in the fall?
No, I think that I'm sure that I don't know who's giving the leadership direction, but I'm sure they'll have a varied program. Yes, Craig.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, visitors who go out to visit Lincoln Park on East Capitol Street are dismayed to find it a slum. Congress has authorized, and the National Council of Negro Women will erect there a memorial stadium and a statue of the great woman educator, Mary Bethune. Now the transit company proposes to put an 8-lane freeway between the park and the Capitol, cutting it off. Could you inquire into that and see if the freeway could be put further out beyond the park?
Yes, I will. It's fine.
President, they told us you took a cab ride or a limousine drive across from your house last night at Lafayette Square to inspect it. In connection with that, you're familiar with the old Velasco Theater on Lafayette Square, which now houses the United Services Organization home for the thousands of enlisted military people in the area. That theater, as you know, is going to be torn down. Does the government, and specifically as you as Commander-in-Chief, have any plans to place these people in a suitable area?
USO? Well, I'm sure we'll be delighted to cooperate with the USO in getting satisfactory facilities. Last night I was looking at the question of the building next to Blair House and whether that ought to come down, the court building, whether that ought to come down or whether trees should be planted there. And I thought that in agreement with the Fine Arts Commission, the trees should be planted there.
Congressman Elder of Texas today criticized Mr. Salinger as a, quote, young and inexperienced White House publicity man, end quote. I questioned the advisability of having him visit the Soviet Union. I wonder if you have any comments.
I know there are always some people who feel that Americans are always young and inexperienced and foreigners are always able and tough and great negotiators, but I don't think that the United States acquired its present position of leadership in the free world if that view were correct. Now, he also, as I saw the press, said that Mr. Salinger's main job was to increase my standing in the Gallup poll. Having done that, he's now moving on to